Hey guys, thanks for joining me today here before our Thanksgiving break. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to our splash screen here. What we're going to be talking about is different forms of criminal punishment that exist in our laws as they stand today. We're going to be talking about criminal sentencing and how that works. You can find the information that I'm going to be presenting to you today in our Unit 2 folder, Week 12 Sentencing, Group B, Week 12, and then Week 12.B1 Sentencing Screencast. So this is where you can find it to follow along later on if you like, and it's also as a PDF here at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So how does criminal sentencing work? Some of the basics here. There's going to be a punishment imposed upon a defendant if they are found guilty or if they plead no contest. They're equivalent in the forms of punishment they could receive. Now, it could take multiple forms. That's what this whole presentation is going to be about, those different forms and a little bit of additional information to go along with it. Now, the judge will decide what the punishment is based on specific parameters. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. An exception to that, though, is the death penalty. The death penalty is decided upon by another case. So in every state except for Montana and Nebraska, after the death penalty is, or after the individual is found guilty of the crimes that could carry the death penalty, there is a case specifically to determine whether or not that the accused will receive the death penalty, and that's decided upon by a jury. In Montana and Nebraska, a judge can make that decision. Now, the guidelines for the various punishments, they're set by local laws, state laws, federal laws. They have a number of years, monetary amounts associated with them, even minimums and maximums. They have mandatory minimums sometimes. They have mandatory maximums sometimes. So there could be examples where the judge is not able to really have their own discretion, which is what we're going to talk about on our next slide here. So a judge usually gets to decide, based on the specifics of that case, where in the spectrum of punishment the convicted will receive. So maybe they're going to go a little bit harsher if it's a particularly heinous crime, if the person has a history of this sort of thing, or there's lack of remorse, whether it is something that the judge determines this individual deserves the harshest punishment possible. They'll go to the high end of the spectrum. First offense is clear remorse. Any agreement to enter in some sort of rehabilitation may result in a much lighter sentence. If the person has multiple charges, they will also receive multiple sentences for each individual charge. We'll get into that in an upcoming slide. For example, multiple homicide convictions could result in multiple life sentences. Many people look at this and they think, well, what's the point of that? There's a few reasons. One, it's symbolic for the victims. If it was a triple homicide and the convicted receives a single life sentence, that life sentence would be attributed to that single homicide, leaving two other homicides in the eyes of the victims and the victims' families, rather, going unpunished. It's also done to fulfill that sense of justice. Those three separate crimes are all receiving their own individual punishments. There's parole could be set, a form of early release that you often hear about in television and movies, but the sentencing itself could actually deny parole. You often will hear about life without the possibility of parole. We'll get to that in this presentation as well. So, when somebody has multiple sentences, it could be established in two different ways. One, concurrent sentences, meaning they're all being served at the same time. So, if the judge determines that this individual should serve their three sentences, let's say a 10-year sentence for crime A, 10-year sentence for crime B, and 15-year sentence for crime C, then the individual will have completed their two 10-year sentences before they finish their third sentence. They'll spend 5 more years in prison for a total of 15 years. they will have the longest sentence that they received be the one that gets fulfilled, because the others will have already been fulfilled. There also is the possibility of consecutive sentences, where rather than it being 10 years, 10 years, 10 years all at the same time, resulting in only 15 years, it could be 10 years, and then the next sentence begins. So another 10 years, so now we're at 20. And then another 15, so now we're at 35 years. That is, again, up to some discretion. An example of this would be James Holmes. If you recall the Aurora movie theater shooting, this probably was around the time you guys were born, maybe a little bit after that, is whenever The Dark Knight Rises premiered. It was a midnight showing. James Holmes went into that movie theater and opened fire with his firearms, and he even had explosive devices in the parking lot for after. He wound up being charged with 24 counts of first-degree murder, 140 counts of attempted first-degree murder, 1 count of possessing an illegal explosive device, and 1 sentence enhancement, which is a thing that exists where if it's a particularly violent or horrendous or heinous crime, they can add additional amounts to those maximums of sentences because of how violent this crime was. He was found guilty of all of these, and since Colorado does not have the death penalty, he could not be eligible for it. There's no way he could be sentenced to death in the state of Colorado where he committed these crimes. So instead, he got 12 life sentences without the possibility of parole to be served consecutively, plus an additional 3,318 years. The judge literally said, "You will never set foot on free soil again. Bailiff, get him out of my courtroom." That was the amount of discretion this judge was able to have, no matter how heinous the crime was. If you don't have the death penalty in your state, you cannot use it. All right, so now we're going to go to the other end. Now we're going to go to the real minor levels, the least harsh forms of sentencing. So there's a suspended sentence. This is where you're found guilty. All of these are going to be you're found guilty. You're convicted of the crimes. And instead of serving your sentence that you're given, whether it's 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is, you may be able to be let go with the assumption that you're now going to fly straight. You're not going to commit other crimes. If the judge believes this, you may have that sentence kind of hanging over your head. And if you're convicted of another crime later on, this sentence would then be applied to it. That's why it's a suspended sentence. You don't have to serve it now, but if you mess up, you're going to have to, along with your sentence for that other crime as well. Probation, you probably have heard of as well. This is where instead of serving time in jail, you are working with a probation officer. This is an officer of the law who monitors those who receive probation. They work with them to try to get back on the right track and make sure they don't commit other crimes. This is going to be for non-violent style crimes. There's often conditions that are going to apply to it. Things like you have to find a job, keep steady employment. If it's a drug or alcohol related crime, you're going to have to stay clean of those things. There's often going to be travel restrictions. You can't leave the state, or maybe it's the county or country. It would depend on the nature of your conviction as well as the judge issuing the sentence. Home confinement is the official term for house arrest. This is one step further than probation, where you're not going to prison, but your ability to move around is extremely limited. You're allowed to be at home, and you're allowed to go to work, or maybe school if you're a student. You have doctor's appointments or any sort of outpatient treatment. If it's a drug or alcohol related thing, going to meetings or other forms of treatment and rehabilitation. Of course, your court dates, you're allowed to go to those. And there's likely going to be a monitoring device. You see this nice piece of jewelry here being worn by star of Herbie Fully Loaded, Lindsay Lohan. A fine. No jail time, no prison time, but you have to pay fines, a monetary punishment, and that money would then go to the government. This would go and be dispersed as that local, state, federal government determines is necessary. We're going to talk a little bit more about different forms of monetary punishment soon, but this is something limited by the Eighth Amendment, nor excessive fines imposed. There's three distinct parts of the Eighth Amendment: cruel and unusual punishment, excessive bail, or excessive fines. So it has to be appropriate to A, the crime committed, and B, the monetary standing of the convicted. So if the person does not have much money, if they are jobless, if they have a low-paying job, a really heavy fine would not be appropriate. Restitution is a little bit different than a fine, because a fine it goes to the government and then is dispersed. Restitution goes to the victim, or the victim's family perhaps. The defendant's required to pay back or make up for whatever was lost due to the injury. Injury being the legal term for something having been done to another person. If the person took money, if they scammed them out of something, they may have to repay that. They may have to give whatever they gained from it in whatever they took, whether it's a scam or theft. They could have to pay restitution for any burden, medical fees, things along those lines, counseling fees, if that would have to be a part of it. And it could go directly to that victim. Or if it's the case in a homicide, could go to the family member of that victim. It could be a victim compensation program. So there are sometimes things set up where there's a group that is designed to provide monetary relief for victims of specific crimes. It could have to be paid to that instead of a specific victim. Or it could be paid to the government as well. Not a fine, but restitution, because instead of having to pay the fine for speeding or whatever the topic was that you were fined for, maybe you have to fix the thing that you broke. If you crashed through the town square, you would have to pay restitution to fix all of the damage you had done, and possibly even to compensate the work that had to be done in order to fix it. Work release, you are in jail during nights and weekends, but you're allowed out to go to work within the community. This is something that focuses on transition. You heard the public defender last week talk about how devastating incarceration can be to an entire life of a person, not just while they're in jail, but afterwards as well. This is trying to ease that transition back, so long as they are within a certain distance of the prison. They keep regular hours, they're not late, they never skip work, things like that. If you do things like that, work release goes away, and now you're just in prison. All right, speaking of prison, you go to jail. You go to prison. Those are two different places. Jail is usually for short-term stuff. It's run by local law enforcement, or that's where you're held while you await trial. Prison is usually a state or federal facility. We have a county facility, CCP, Cumberland County Prison, and this is going to be for more serious crimes and therefore longer sentences. Now, your imprisonment may be a specific amount of time, 10 years, 35 years, or it could be a range. It could be 5 to 10. In this case, I have 3, not less than 3, but no more than 5. It would depend on the design of the sentencing placed on them by the judge. While in prison, though, you could be released early. So parole is similar to probation, except you have been in prison and have been released early for good behavior, to ease the transition back to civilian life. There are often hearings that are done in order to determine whether or not the person is, quote, fit to re-enter society. You see these in TV and movies all the time. You hear about individuals like Charles Manson, who had multiple parole hearings for his crimes and was always denied parole. So he was not able to be released. You'll be under the supervision of a parole officer, and it will be similar, as I said, to probation. You have to find a job. You can't, go certain distances outside of the vicinity, like you can't leave the state, things like that.